Hey everyone! Welcome back! If you're new here, hit that subscribe button because today's video is going to blow your mind. August 15th, 2021. Kabul, Afghanistan. The Taliban sweeps into the presidential palace. After 20 years of fighting, after trillions of dollars spent, after thousands of American lives lost, the Taliban is back in power. The same Taliban that America went to war against in 2001. The same Taliban that harbored Osama bin Laden. The same Taliban that the United States spent 2 decades trying to destroy. But here's the thing nobody wants to talk about. The CIA trained them. The CIA armed them. The CIA created them. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is declassified history. This is the story of Operation Cyclone, the largest covert operation in CIA history. And it's the story of how America's Cold War obsession created its greatest enemy. By the end of this video, you'll understand why 9/11 happened, why we spent 20 years in Afghanistan, and why it all ended exactly where it started. Let's dive in. December 24th, 1979. Christmas Eve. While Americans are celebrating, Soviet tanks roll across the border into Afghanistan. Over 100,000 Soviet troops invade. They overthrow the Afghan government and install a puppet regime. The Cold War, which had been fought through proxies around the world, just arrived in Central Asia. And the United States loses its mind. You have to understand the context. This is 1979. Just 4 years earlier, America had lost in Vietnam. The Iranian Revolution had just happened. America's ally, the Shah, was overthrown. The Soviet Union seemed unstoppable. President Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, sees the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as a massive threat. Not just to Afghanistan, but to the entire region. Here's what people don't know. The CIA had actually started supporting Afghan rebels 6 months before the Soviet invasion. That's right. America was already meddling in Afghanistan, trying to provoke a Soviet response. Brzezinski later admitted this in a 1998 interview. He said, and I quote, "We didn't push the Russians to intervene, but we knowingly increased the probability that they would." Why? Because he wanted to give the Soviet Union its own Vietnam. He wanted to bleed them in an unwinnable war. Mission accomplished, Zbig. But nobody could have predicted the consequences. When the Soviets invade, the CIA operation goes into overdrive. It's renamed Operation Cyclone, and it becomes the largest, most expensive covert operation in CIA history. The goal: arm and train Afghan fighters, the Mujahideen, to resist the Soviet occupation. Now, the CIA doesn't do this directly. They can't. If Soviet soldiers were killed by American weapons, it could trigger World War III. So they worked through Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI. Here's how it worked. The CIA gives money and weapons to Pakistan's ISI. The ISI gives them to the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen fight the Soviets. Everyone pretends America isn't involved. But America was very involved. Between 1979 and 1989, the United States spent over $3 billion on Operation Cyclone. That's over $7 billion in today's money. Saudi Arabia matched it dollar for dollar. That's $14 billion total, flooding into Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. And it wasn't just money. The CIA was training Mujahideen fighters, teaching them guerrilla warfare, teaching them how to use advanced weapons, teaching them tactics that would later be used against American soldiers. The architect of much of this was a Texas congressman named Charlie Wilson. If you've seen the movie Charlie Wilson's War with Tom Hanks, you know the story. Wilson was obsessed with defeating the Soviets in Afghanistan. He pushed for more funding, more weapons, more everything. And the weapons they provided were game changers. In 1986, the CIA made a decision that would change everything. They gave the Mujahideen Stinger missiles. Stinger missiles are portable, shoulder-fired anti-aircraft weapons. Point at a helicopter or jet, pull the trigger, and boom, aircraft destroyed. Before Stingers, Soviet helicopters ruled the Afghan battlefield. They could attack Mujahideen positions with impunity. But after Stingers, the skies belonged to the Mujahideen. Soviet helicopter losses skyrocketed. Their casualties mounted. The war became unwinnable. A CIA officer named Michael Vickers, who helped plan the operation, later said, "The Stinger was the weapon that won the war." But here's what nobody asked. What happens to those Stingers after the Soviets leave? What happens to the trained fighters? What happens to the networks of Islamic militants we just created? Nobody thought about that. Or if they did, they didn't care. Before we continue, hit that like button if you're learning something new. This story gets darker. Now, the CIA needed fighters. Lots of them. But where do you recruit soldiers for a holy war? Enter the madrasas. Pakistan, with CIA money and Saudi religious ideology, built thousands of Islamic religious schools along the Afghanistan border. These madrasas taught extreme, fundamentalist version of Islam called Deobandi. Young Afghan refugees, displaced by the Soviet war, went to these schools. They were indoctrinated with a militant interpretation of Islam. They were told that fighting and dying for jihad was the highest honor. These students, Taliban in Pashto, would later give their name to the movement that would rule Afghanistan. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. The CIA also needed to recruit fighters from across the Muslim world. So they worked with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan to create what they called the Arab Afghans, volunteers from across the Middle East who came to fight the Soviets. One of these volunteers was a wealthy Saudi named Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden arrived in Afghanistan in the early 1980s. He used his family money to fund Mujahideen fighters. He built training camps. He fought alongside them. Now, did the CIA directly work with bin Laden? That's debated. Some sources say yes, some say no. What's not debated? The CIA funded and armed the same groups bin Laden was part of. The same training camps. The same weapons networks. The CIA was building infrastructure for Islamic militants. And bin Laden was using that infrastructure. Here's a quote from bin Laden himself, years later. The collapse of the Soviet Union came about not only because of economic reasons, but also because of the Afghan jihad. We trained thousands of Muslims from all over the world in our camps in Afghanistan. He's not wrong. The Mujahideen weren't a unified force. They were different factions, different tribes, different ideologies. Some were relatively moderate Afghan nationalists. Others were hardcore Islamic fundamentalists. The CIA and Pakistan preferentially supported the most extreme groups. Why? Because they fought hardest against the Soviets. One of the biggest recipients of CIA support was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, an extremist warlord who threw acid in the faces of women who didn't wear veils. The CIA gave him hundreds of millions of dollars. Another major recipient was the Haqqani Network, which would later become one of the most lethal insurgent groups fighting American troops. The CIA created a monster. Actually, many monsters. And they were all learning from each other. By 1989, the Soviets had had enough. After 10 years, 15,000 Soviet deaths, and massive economic strain, they withdrew from Afghanistan. The Mujahideen had won. The Soviet Union would collapse 2 years later. In Washington, Operation Cyclone was considered one of the greatest intelligence successes ever. Mission accomplished, right? Not even close. Because here's what happened next. The United States abandoned Afghanistan. The CIA stopped funding the Mujahideen. The weapons pipeline dried up. American interest evaporated overnight. Afghanistan descended into civil war. The different Mujahideen factions turned on each other. Kabul was destroyed by rocket attacks. Warlords carved up the country. It became a failed state. And into this chaos emerged the Taliban. The Taliban started in 1994 in Kandahar, led by a one-eyed Mujahideen veteran named Mullah Omar. Their initial goal was to bring order to a chaotic, war-torn country using strict Islamic law. They were initially welcomed. After years of warlord violence and corruption, many Afghans saw the Taliban as bringing stability. And here's the kicker. Pakistan's ISI, the same intelligence service the CIA had worked with, actively supported the Taliban's rise to power. They saw the Taliban as a way to control Afghanistan. In 1996, the Taliban controlled most of Afghanistan, including Kabul. They imposed one of the most extreme interpretations of Islamic law ever seen. Women couldn't work, couldn't go to school, couldn't leave their homes without male relatives. Music was banned. Television was banned. Ancient Buddha statues were destroyed. But the international community largely ignored it. Afghanistan had served its purpose in the Cold War. Nobody cared what happened there now. Well, almost nobody. Drop a comment below. Did you know any of this before watching this video? Remember Osama bin Laden? He hadn't been sitting idle. After the Soviet war, bin Laden returned to Saudi Arabia as a hero. But he became disillusioned with the Saudi royal family, especially when they allowed American troops to be stationed in Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War. And bin Laden's eyes, infidel soldiers in the land of Islam's holiest sites was unforgivable. He began plotting against both the Saudi regime and America, moved to Sudan in 1992, where he built businesses and continued building his network, which would become Al-Qaeda, the base. But in 1996, under pressure from the United States and Saudi Arabia, Sudan expelled bin Laden. Where did he go? Back to Afghanistan. Back to the country where he'd fought the Soviets. Back to the training camps the CIA had helped build. The Taliban welcomed him. Mullah Omar and bin Laden formed a bond. The Taliban gave Al-Qaeda sanctuary. Bin Laden gave the Taliban money, fighters, and international connections. By the late 1990s, Afghanistan under Taliban rule had become the world's premier terrorist training ground. Thousands of militants from across the globe came to train there. The CIA knew this. The State Department knew this. But there was debate about what to do. Some officials wanted to engage with the Taliban, hoping to moderate them. Others wanted aggressive action against bin Laden and al-Qaeda. But there was no clear policy, no decisive action. Meanwhile, al-Qaeda was escalating. In 1998, al-Qaeda bombed U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing 224 people, including 12 Americans. President Clinton ordered cruise missile strikes on al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan. They missed bin Laden, and in 2000, al-Qaeda bombed the USS Cole in Yemen, killing 17 American sailors. Still, no decisive action. The Clinton administration tried to work with Pakistan to pressure the Taliban. But Pakistan's ISI had its own agenda. They wanted the Taliban in power. They weren't about to betray their own creation. The CIA tried to recruit Afghan allies to capture or kill bin Laden. But it was half-hearted, under-resourced, inadequate. There were warnings. Lots of warnings. Intelligence reports about al-Qaeda planning major attacks. But in Washington, terrorism wasn't seen as a top priority. Then came September 11, 2001. Commercial airplanes hijacked. 2 crashed into the World Trade Center. 1 into the Pentagon. 1 into a Pennsylvania field. Nearly 3,000 people dead. The worst terrorist attack in American history. The world changed forever. And the mastermind was Osama bin Laden, operating from Afghanistan under Taliban protection. The same bin Laden who'd been part of the CIA-funded Mujahideen in the 1980s. The blowback had arrived. October 7, 2001. Less than a month after September 11, the United States invades Afghanistan. The goal: destroy al-Qaeda. Remove the Taliban from power. Capture or kill Osama bin Laden. The irony is thick. America was now at war with fighters they had trained, using tactics they had taught, in terrain they had learned to fight in against. America. The Taliban had Stinger missiles, American Stinger missiles from the 1980s. They had training in guerrilla warfare, from CIA instructors. They knew how to fight a superpower, because they'd already beaten one. The initial invasion was quick. The Taliban regime fell within weeks. Al-Qaeda fled to the mountains. The Northern Alliance, enemies of the Taliban, took Kabul with American air support. But bin Laden escaped. In December 2001, he was cornered in the Tora Bora Mountains. CIA officers begged for Army Rangers and Marines to be sent to block his escape routes into Pakistan. The Pentagon refused. They didn't want to commit ground troops. They relied on Afghan allies and airstrikes. Bin Laden escaped into Pakistan. He wouldn't be found for another 10 years. And the Taliban? They weren't destroyed. They retreated to Pakistan, regrouped, and began an insurgency. What followed was 20 years of grinding war. The longest war in American history. The United States tried nation building. Tried creating democracy. Spent over $2 trillion. Lost over 2,400 American soldiers and over 100,000 Afghan civilians. But the Taliban never went away. Supported by Pakistan's ISI, the same ISI the CIA had worked with in the 1980s, the Taliban fought from the shadows. Every few years, there would be optimism. We're turning the corner. The Taliban is weakening. Just one more year. It was Vietnam all over again, and 2011. Navy SEALs finally killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. But the war in Afghanistan continued. President after president promised to end it. Bush couldn't. Obama couldn't. Trump couldn't. Finally, in 2021, President Biden announced the full withdrawal of American troops. On August 15, 2021, almost exactly 20 years after September 11, the Taliban marched into Kabul. The Afghan government collapsed. The president fled. In a matter of weeks, everything America had fought for evaporated. The scenes were haunting. Afghans desperately clinging to departing American planes, some falling to their deaths. The Taliban, in American-supplied vehicles and weapons, taking victory photos in the presidential palace. He ended exactly where it began in 1996. The Taliban in power. Afghanistan isolated. Women and girls once again denied basic rights. 20 years. Trillions of dollars. Thousands of lives. And for what? So what's the lesson here? The story of Afghanistan is the story of American foreign policy's greatest failure. Not the failure to win the war, the failure to learn from blowback. In the 1980s, America armed Islamic militants to fight the Soviets. It worked. The Soviets lost. But those militants didn't just disappear. They created the Taliban. They created al-Qaeda. They planned 9/11, so America invaded Afghanistan to fight the very forces it had created. And after 20 years, those forces are back in power. It's the definition of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Here's what drives me crazy. This wasn't unpredictable. CIA analysts warned about blowback. State Department officials warned about extremism. But policymakers didn't care. Short-term wins mattered more than long-term consequences. Defeating the Soviets mattered more than thinking about what comes next. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the architect of arming the Mujahideen, was asked in that 1998 interview if he regretted it. He said, "What is more important to the history of the world? The Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire?" That interview was in 1998, 3 years before September 11th. I wonder if he'd answer the same way today. The tragedy isn't just Afghanistan. The tragedy is that America keeps making the same mistake. We armed Saddam Hussein against Iran in the 1980s. Then we went to war with him twice. We supported moderate rebels in Syria. Many ended up joining ISIS. We keep thinking we can control forces we unleash. We keep thinking we can arm militants, use them for our purposes, and face no consequences. We're always wrong. The story of the Taliban isn't just about Afghanistan. It's about the unintended consequences of short-sighted foreign policy. It's about how yesterday's allies become tomorrow's enemies. It's about how you can't bomb your way out of problems you created with bombs. And here's the most sobering part. As of right now, in 2025, the Taliban controls Afghanistan. They're using American weapons left behind in the withdrawal. They're governing using the same brutal tactics. And American policymakers are already talking about the next intervention, the next proxy war, the next group of militants we can support against our enemies. We never learn. The CIA created the Taliban. America spent 20 years fighting them. And now they're back in power. Mission accomplished. This video opened your eyes to a part of history they don't teach in school. Smash that like button and subscribe for more content that challenges the official narrative. Drop a comment below. What shocked you most about this story? Did you know the CIA armed the Mujahideen? What other foreign policy disasters should I cover next? Share this video with anyone who needs to understand why forever wars keep happening. The algorithm doesn't promote content that challenges government narratives, so your shares matter. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, history doesn't repeat, but it sure as hell rhymes. Thanks for watching.